I'm basically just going to give you a really short talk about a project that MSAC contracted to have done a few months ago. There was a desire to have someone go back and do a literature search to try to find some of the historical documentation about sedimentation in Lewis and Clark Lake, and what some of the thoughts, ideas, opinions were clear back when the lake was first filled, and how that changed over time. So Sandy Stockholm worked with a contractor, put a contract together, and he did a literature search through multiple sources and came up with a lot of documentation. Basically, as part of his contract, he was looking for historical news articles, photographs, letters, legal, and other documents that are available in the public record. And this was done by Upper Midwest Genealogy Services out of Sioux Falls. What he came up with was 123 documents that he categorized, and they ranged in time period from 1945 to 2018. He categorized the documents that he came up with into multiple categories, as you can see up here. Those that dealt with the Pick-Sloan Plan, those that dealt with the history and construction of Gavins Point Dam, those that dealt with sediment buildup, with flooding and erosion issues, and also with legal actions that have taken place over the decades because of Gavins Point Dam and sedimentation issues. So I just wanted to give you some idea of the types of documents that he found. The majority of what I'm showing here are historical newspaper articles that talked about these issues that he scanned and put in these folders. Here's an early one from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from 1947 where it talks about the plight of the Missouri River Valley and the fact that it's having record floods and so on. And notice that this is 3 years after the Flood Control Act of 1944. So apparently there was trouble getting monies appropriated to actually build the Pick-Sloan Plan even after the plan was authorized by Congress. And so in this newspaper article, if you read one of the subtitles here, it says, President Truman's call for a comprehensive program for the entire Missouri-Mississippi watershed and $250 million to go with it. So this is then apparently the start of actual funding for the Pick-Sloan Plan that came about in 1947. But even though the funding began to happen, Gavins Point Dam was tough to get funded. And so there are several newspaper articles that he scanned and found where Gavins Point Dam once again was taken off the board for funding. And so here's an example in the Argus Leader, a 1950 article that says that the funds are unlikely for Gavins Point. But then just to show you how quickly things can change, which is good hope for our situation today, 1 year later, another article in the Argus Leader newspaper in 1951 says Gavins Point's target date is set for 1956. So suddenly in that year they went from being not funded to having full funding and even a target date for opening up or for finishing construction of the dam. Here is an article actually out of a newspaper in Virginia from 1953 where they're talking about what the impacts of the Pick-Sloan Plan are going to have on the Missouri River. And so sort of the same things that we talk about historically today about how that re-engineering of the river really changed the face of the river. Before it even happened, they were talking about the impacts that it would have and the changes it would make to the river clear back in 1953. But of course there were problems early on too. And so here a South Dakota state senator is upset because the state is going to have to buy a lot of the land along the reservoir for recreation. And they were under the assumption that the federal government would just give that land to the state to use for recreation. This is an interesting article that was in the LA Times in 1954. And so here they're talking about some of the impacts that we're starting to see as these dams are built on the Missouri River. And the thing that they're talking about is exactly the reason why we're here today. The dams are clearing up the muddy Missouri. All the sediment's dropping out. They didn't talk a lot about where it was dropping out, but they talked about the fact that below these dams, the river is much clearer than it used to be. And they talked a lot about impacts that has on fishing and so on, mostly for the good. But it's interesting because in this article, they did mention there were some drawbacks to having this lack of sediment in the water. But mainly what they were talking about was that it created basically the hungry water that you see downstream of the dams. And a lot of the landowners thought that they were experiencing higher rates of bank erosion because of the lack of sediment. And they also correctly pointed out that now you don't have the rich, fertile sediments being deposited on the floodplain to create the soils that we've become so accustomed to, the rich, fertile soils for farming. There was a mention of sediment being deposited in reservoirs, but the people that they talked to in the story on the federal government level said that it really wasn't a problem because the design life, for example, of Lewis and Clark Lake is 250 years. So this is something that you sort of see recurring over and over with this, is that when these things are first built, it seems like such a long way out before they hit their design life. But in reality, just like with the problem we're seeing today, well before the end of the project, you start to see these impacts, just like we're starting to see well before the end of the life of the project, already it's impacting people's lives. This one out of the Beatrice, Nebraska, a newspaper. It was an AP article they picked up. And it's pretty interesting because this is 1963, and the article they're writing about is that silt deposits in Lewis and Clark are a problem of state and national concern. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that when we look at the historical air photos from the area, Gavin's Point Dam was closed off in 1955. Obviously, sediment started precipitating out of the river immediately because it was entering the lake, but you didn't see it at the surface. And even when we look at air photos from the 1960s, there's really not a sediment problem showing up. And it doesn't really show up until the 1970s. But people were, even though you weren't seeing it visually, people were obviously feeling the effects of it even before you started to see it visually. And that's comes out in this article that was in a 1963 newspaper. So just 3 years after that, we get Gavin's Point silt flow as target. And here, one of our most renowned senators from South Dakota, Carl Mundt, he had sort of ramrodded this study by the Corps of Engineers to look at basically what could be done about all this sediment entering Lewis and Clark Lake. This is clear back in 1966. One of the main solutions they were looking at back then was to build a reservoir on the Niobrara River that would capture that. And in one of his statements here, basically what he says is that our studies show that this reservoir near the mouth of the Niobrara River would solve the Gavin's Point sedimentation problem and so on. So basically they were looking at that as a one-stop solution for the entire sedimentation problem. 1965, you start seeing references to the problems that the sedimentation is causing for the town of Niobrara already. So they're talking about the sedimentation basically increasing the flood troubles that Niobrara is having. And then in 1970, the town of Niobrara has a relocation meeting. They're getting together in 1970 to talk about what can be done about the problem, what can be done about relocating the town. And then we all know what happened after that. And in 1975, an article, again in a Nebraska newspaper, about Tiny Niobrara's first Christmas on the hill. So by Christmas of 75, the town had pretty much been rebuilt up on the hill. And then there's just a lot of documentation that goes on through the decades, but it just sort of gives you a perspective on how long we've been talking about this. The first article about the sedimentation problems that we've seen in this showed up in 1963, and in 1999, the Argus Leader is doing a a full special section on the Missouri River, and one of the things that they talked about was the sedimentation problem in Lewis and Clark Lake. And it goes all the way up through a Lincoln Star Journal article in December of 2018, which was an article about the sediment management plan that Paul Boyd from the Corps of Engineers is here to talk about with us today. So that's basically just a synopsis of what this is about, and I just wanted to give you an idea of what it is we were finding. Mark, I think with that we'll turn it over to you again.
Okay, now we're going to get an update from Nathan Schaepe, hydrologist, GIS specialist for the USGS.
Yeah, so I'm not going to take too much of your time, but I just wanted to make everyone aware that USGS is planning to do a LiDAR survey on the Niobrara River from Norden all the way down to the mouth. It's tentatively planned for August 7th and 8th. Obviously, that's weather dependent, and it has to be certain conditions for the airplane to go up. But that's what's planned for now. We only are able to ground truth a certain section of the river, which we're trying to decide which part of the river to focus on. There's hope that we might get additional funding to ground truth other areas, but that's where it stands. I have my card that I'll leave with Sandy, so if, there's actually a stakeholders meeting on Friday, a WebEx, which I believe Paul is going to be part of. So if there's anyone interested in sitting in on that call, feel free to email me. I can get you that information. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Can you just tell us what LiDAR does? Or?
Sure, yeah. So LiDAR is basically a fancy method of surveying. You send an airplane up in the air and it sends down, it's kind of like radar. If you can think of how radar works, it shoots down some rays, and then based on the topography, the airplane measures the height of those rays. And this particular radar we're doing is called green radar, and it's able to, well, supposedly it should be able to give us an idea of the channel shape as well as the topography around it. So it could give us water depths, and that's why ground truthing would be really important. The more we can ground truth, the more we can verify that it's actually getting the channel throughout this segment that we're interested in. Yeah.
So do you have any early indications? Are you expecting to see major changes, or?
Yeah. with the Spencer Dam recent developments, as you may say, yeah, we're expecting to see some pretty large differences. And the Corps has done some surveying in segments downstream of Spencer. So I'm really interested to see how that turns out. It's possible, I don't know, Paul, you might talk about that they might be able to do some additional surveying in that segment as well. And so, yeah, I'm really interested to see what we find, how much sediment was released during this last flood. I'm sure it was quite substantial, and we'll have to figure out what that means going forward. In fact, reason I was a little bit late, I stopped over we have a gauge at Verdell, and I was installing a game camera to just keep an eye on how sandbars are forming in that section, seeing, if we get additional, we've been lucky in that it's been pretty dry, but if we get additional rains, we'll see how much that impacts things, and we'll be able to compare those photographs based on, since we have a gauge there, we can compare our stage and look at when these sandbars are getting covered with water and when they're bare, and it'll give us an idea how quickly the sediment is moving downstream. So,
will your information be part of any report, or is it data that you use?
The LiDAR data? Yeah. Yes, eventually. I think it's going to be part. Don't quote me on this. If you Yeah, if you email me, I can get you the specifics. There's another person in my office that's kind of running the show for this, and I think this is part of a more national program, but this is one of the areas that they selected to be a part of it. So I think it'll be eventually, yeah, the data will be public. I can guarantee that, whether it comes out in a report or if the data is just made publicly available through what we call a data release, that I'm not sure of yet.
Thank you. Now we're gonna do an update with Sandy Stockholm, MSAC's Executive Director, and Brian Holm, Streamside Environmental, if he's here.
Brian didn't make it today. He's actually in Texas working on sediment collectors down in Texas. But our intent is to possibly get him available through a webinar or something so we can hear more information about where they're at. If you've been following us for any amount of time, you've heard us talk about sediment collectors on the Niobrara River, and just looking at that technology as possibly a way to slow down the process at Lewis and Clark Lake, maybe help the immediate vicinity here. But one of the challenges with that whole system is what do you do with the sediment once you've collected it. So we had applied or submitted a proposal to the Corps. They were selecting 10 pilot projects to look at beneficial uses for dredged material. And we did find out in December of 2018 that that proposal was not accepted or selected. But just so you have that on your radar screen, it might be some kind of innovative technology that's considered in the sediment management plan. We don't really want to rule anything out at this point, so we want to learn more about what technology is out there. There were 10 projects that were selected, and I don't know, they were around the country. I have the list on the computer if anyone wants to see it. I can give you that information. But there were 96 projects submitted and 10 were selected. So we're forging ahead with Section 22. Paul will give you more information about that today. But we're really focused on the sediment management plan. Something like sediment collectors would be a component or a part of a bigger plan. So we'll keep you updated on that.
Okay, as I mentioned before, Niobrara was affected a great deal by this storm. We lost a lot of businesses. We lost a lot of infrastructure. I'm gonna have Jody Stark come up. He is the unofficial mayor of Niobrara.
Thanks, Mark. So everybody kind of knows what happened a month or so ago. We had a historic flooding event, and obviously a lot of the area was affected. I mean, not just Niobrara, but I'm going to talk about Niobrara and Pacific because a lot of our neighboring communities, farmers, ranchers are greatly affected in this as well. So, but the flood, obviously, we had several businesses down below that were devastated, and they've been out of business. They're working really hard trying to get back up and going. As far as the town, we lost during that flood. We lost our main water supply. We were without drinkable water for about 12 days here. Power was for about a day and a half. We were pretty fortunate that way. Power was back on, but the water was the big thing. And then also we have probably going to have some issues with our sewer system as well. We're still in the process of analyzing that. Our lift stations were down there in the flood zone, so they were impacted. And so we're probably going to be analyzing that as well. But, you know, I guess, I don't know what else you're going to kind of touch on, Mark. I think the biggest concern right now is just the economy for the local community of Niobrara. You know, depend really high with the state park, tourists coming in, hunting, fishing, all that. You know, I guess my message would be the business owners are here. They want, you know, we're going to need some business. We're going to need some help. We want people to come and see us. We're open. We're doing the best we can. Obviously, the roadways on Highway 12 to the west, the bridges are damaged yet. we're very fortunate the DOT did get on this one right away to the east of town. And then we had some impact of the bridge south of town here it was a deteriorating bridge anyway that had some issues because of the flood, but they did get on those right away, so we've been getting some traffic back. But yeah, the economy and the tourism right now is just huge for this area. The golf course was another thing that was really impacted. Destroyed the clubhouse and ruined that. That was a big recreational item here for us in town as well. So with that, I guess, is there anything else you want me to talk about, Mark?
No, you're doing, that was good, Joey. And he's had to do a lot of interviews with the news media, which he's a lot like me, he's not used to that sort of thing, but he's done a great job. So I want to thank him for everything he's done.
Thanks, Mark.
Also, we're working on trying to get access back to the river. Unfortunately, the Missouri's still high. Boat Landing is still underwater, but we got a temporary setup, which we're trying to get a road down to. So if you're interested in coming fishing this summer or duck hunting in the fall, we're doing our best to get something going to help you. Next, we're gonna have Paul Boyd come up, and he's driven here a long ways today, and he always does a good job, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know most of the faces in the room, and we were last up here with Brad when we were talking different study authorities, and I want to say September. Does that sound about right? And at the time, we were trying to determine a way forward on this sediment management plan. And I want to give you a little summary of where we did an abbreviated version of how we got there, and then what we've done recently here. So let's get this up. There we go. Okay. We had a lot of slides for this last time, but we'll shorten this down. Most of you have lived on the river most of your life, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But anyway, here we are. And just a reminder that of the perpetual battle that it is to meet all the authorized project purposes of this system. As we like to say, one of these things is not like the other. Remember when we all watched Sesame Street? One of these things is not the same, okay? One of these authorized purposes takes an empty reservoir. The other 7 take a full reservoir to get the maximum amount of benefits from them. So to balance all of those, we're somewhere in the middle. We're not full, we're not empty. The question becomes where in the middle? Are you closer to full? Are you closer to empty? And the like. So obviously for that flood control authorized project purpose, the emptier the reservoir, the better. For the rest of those, the more water you have in general, the better. So quickly, you folks all know how this goes. Imagine that yellow wedge kind of from Lazy River Acres to about the mouth of Bazille Creek in that shape. And we do have, and I think Tim alluded to this earlier, you can't see them, but there are another 3 or 4 feet of fine sediments at the bottom of the reservoir that go all the way down to the dam. So if you take that, in addition to what you see, mostly sand in the delta there, you also have a couple of feet of that fine silt or muck for that lower 15 miles that also affects our storage volume in the system. This is an idealized diagram with outlets at the bottom. How I would love to have outlets at the bottom of Gavins Point Dam. That would have been a great idea. Somebody should have thought of that. Anyway, changes in Missouri River Mainstem reservoirs. This is just a summary of the storage or volume changes in the system throughout the history of the 6 mainstems. Obviously, the capacity is very large in the top 3, and it's relatively much smaller in the bottom 3. What kind of gets lost in a diagram of this scale is that, yes, as of the 2011 survey, from the top of the flood control pool through the full reservoir, we'd lost approximately 26-27% of the total storage, different amounts in different pools, in the flood control, the multi-purpose pool, the permanent pool. And as I think we can all probably guess, that number is even smaller now in 2019 than it was in 2011. So in reservoir design, how was sediment addressed in the design? How did the designers estimate how much sediment was going to come into the system? And how close are we to those numbers today? Well, it was addressed in the design of this system by a storage pool, a permanent pool or a dead pool or a sediment pool, which had a volume allocated to it that was going to be conceded or lost to sediment. That was just accepted as part of the design procedure. We all know that rivers don't work exactly like the design. They didn't take all the sediment and drop it right down in the very bottom, right? They spread it out over this whole reach as it approaches into the reservoir. Especially in this generation of this system, dam designs did not often include any sort of physical infrastructure for managing sediment. Flushing gates, bypasses, check dams in the watershed, whatever it might be, the general approach here was to allocate a certain volume of the reservoir to be lost to sediment. How was the sediment yield estimated? From what few gauges there were, and the gauge data from the early 20th century and watershed studies that were done at the time to come up with an estimate of how much sediment was going to come in. And then we can ask the question, how close were they? Did these folks who developed these plans have any idea of how much sediment was going to come into the system? And there are a couple. This is the 6 main stems here. The Garrison one is a little out of whack because there weren't other things designed in the system at the time. The same thing with Lake Francis Case, the one directly upstream here. When it was designed and put in the system, there was not a plan for Oahe. Well, Oahe collects a lot of the sediment that would have normally ended up in Randall. Down here at Gavin's Point, Lewis and Clark Lake, surprisingly close. Within about 15 to 20% of the long-term estimated average, they're right there. So that doesn't help the case any, because that says that the designers knew that this kind of sediment load was in the system and it was in the watershed and it would be delivered to the Missouri through the Missouri itself and its tributaries. So there's the headwaters. There's just an aerial image. That was 2016. And then we can look back just historically at some of the different curves of where, the delta has moved. That's a rough estimate for 2035. The one thing that you will see visually as we go forward into the future here is it will appear that the delta slows down, okay? Is not slowing down. It simply looks like it's slowing down because it's delivering sediment into deeper and deeper and deeper water. Okay, when it was originally delivering material up into here, the water depths here off of Springfield were only, in some cases, a few feet, 6, 7, 8 feet at best. But now that we're down depositing sediment in this reach, it's about 15 feet of water. As we move farther and farther down the river, you go to 20, 25, 30, 35 feet of water. So it doesn't mean that the sedimentation rate is changing. It means that the distribution within the system is a little bit different. So if we take that number, and I know most of you folks saw this slide last fall, if we take this long-term average of 2,600 some acre feet, right? 1 acre foot is an acre of area 1 foot deep, okay? So you take an acre foot, you get 2,600 of those a year. And if we were to simplify that volume into different vessels to move that sediment away, whether it be trucks or train cars or barges, this just gives you an average daily rate of the sediment that's collected. Now that's just in the reservoir. That doesn't include what's being deposited out here. So those numbers are, likely smaller than if you were to address the entire issue from Lazy River Acres all the way down into the lake. But this is valuable to just kind of try and wrap your head around this 1,200 dump trucks a day to move the sediment out that's coming through there. So, and we've also seen, obviously, that we know the history around here, that the aggradation has caused a raise in water surface and subsequent groundwater elevations. And here is the Niobrara, the Missouri River at Niobrara gauge right at the bottom of the hill here. And we've seen in general at, a median discharge of 30,000 CFS, a raising of roughly 10 feet since closure of the dam. Okay, that big drop off right there is the 2011 event, which, while not a good thing at all and never a way to manage a river, did have the unintended benefit of opening up that channel down there. But as you might expect, that is a temporary respite from this long-term trend, which will continue to do that without any sort of change. So we talked a little bit last fall when Brad Thompson, who is the chief of planning at the Corps office in Omaha, came and talked a little bit about this WRDA 2016 Section 1179A, which was put into this WRDA is the Water Resources Development Act. It's intended to be renewed and refreshed every 2 years by Congress. Doesn't quite go on that basis, as with most things in Congress. Doesn't quite move as fast as it should. But this was an act or an authorization put in Civil Works specifically for developing reservoir sediment management plans on the upper Missouri River. That would be the area above Gavin's, so in this area. Calls for a basin pilot program and identifying a number of plan elements that should be part of the development of plans, lays out some rules for cost share and the like. And this was definitely a step forward, getting it on paper that these actions need to happen. Brad and myself had a number of discussions with our headquarters and in the planning community of practice about how we would start one of these studies. And in writing the implementation for it, the Corps headquarters decided that an 1179 study would be what we call a new start. That means it has to be authorized and as a completely new study. Those are, with all the other going needs and priorities, those are almost as rare as hen's teeth, and they're pretty hard to get. We only have a few of them every year in each district. And one of the limitations is that this is often, a new start is oftentimes reserved for very large projects. Not that this might not end up there, but right now it is not a very large project. So in the end, it came down to, it was signed into law. We developed guidance. You can go, all the guidance is public. You can go read what, one, the law says, and then two, what the Corps of Engineers headquarters determined its interpretation of the how to implement the law. It calls for a sediment management plan and to carry out a pilot program. Okay. Now, I say this now because in just a second we're going to talk about another authority, which is how we're going to move forward. The nice thing about this is it gives us a framework, and it provides kind of a roadmap, and we can use that roadmap in this other authority. And it laid out in that 1179 what a sediment management plan shall do. What is its intent? What should it consider? What should be part of the analysis? Provide opportunities for stakeholders to participate, evaluate the volume and impact, preliminary sediment management options, look at constraints, technical feasibility. This is important, and economic justification and environmental impacts, beneficial uses, demonstrate innovative cost-saving technologies. And we'll get a couple slides down, you'll see we've taken that type of, that management framework and brought it almost verbatim into what we're intending to do with a section 22. Okay, the last bullet is one of the important parts here. 1179A does have an opportunity for construction. It is one of the authorizations where if you do a study and it is economically justified and there is a construction project at the end of it, this authorization allows you to move forward, try and get money from Congress, and put that project on the ground. Okay? And so Section 22, which we'll talk about, does not do that. It allows us the study part of it. However, we're not precluded from going back if we have a construction project, if we have something to implement after we are done with this planning study. We can always reach back and request a start here. One of the concerns was primarily that we'd be a little slow in getting started if we waited for a new start under 1179. 1179 falls under general investigations, which means it's 50-50 federal cost share and sponsor. And then if there is a construction project, it is 65% federal, 35% non-federal. Okay. So right now, we are going to focus and put our efforts into a feasibility study to see if we can find a cost-effective and practical management action to preserve some of the benefits of the reservoir. So we'll talk about this. What we're using is Planning Assistance to States and Tribes Authority. It's called Section 22 of the WRDA way back in 1974. It's primarily for technical planning, engineering services. It has the same cost share as the 1179. It's very wide-ranging. It does not lead to construction. The program is funded and ongoing, and that's one of the advantages of going with Section 22. Our district has more discretionary oversight of those federal resources that we can apply to this study. So there is a pot of federal funding already for these Section 22s that we can leverage right now. Why Section 22? One, as we said, the implementation guidance assigning or identifying Section 1179 as a new start. There are very limited new starts each year. And a new start, we are now in the process of working on the 2021 federal budget. So any request for a new start falls into the 2021 budget if it were to be funded. And being that it's still 2019, we're not really excited about waiting 2 years and maybe getting a new start. And so it has the same cost share. We can start right now. And like I said, we have more access and influence on obtaining the federal government's matching share for any Section 22. Why not? Why wouldn't we do this? Well, there's no scope framework. 1179 says it's a sediment plan. It shall do these things. It shall have these outcomes. So we don't have that framework. That's a plus and a minus. So one, we don't have that framework, but neither are we limited to that framework. You know, it is up to our office and the sponsor to define the project area. Okay, that project area is a little more limited in its definition under 1179. Why not? Because it has no construction authority. As we said, if we get down the road through this process and our sediment management plan looks like there is an actionable, implementable process that we can put on the ground to manage sediment, then we would, if it's going in that direction, we would likely request a new start and get in whatever budget year we are planning for, and request a new start under 1179 to get that construction authority. So if we're going to develop a sediment management plan, what we're going to do is we're going to do it under section 22, but we're going to use this guidance and framework of 1179. And I promise this is about the last where I'll talk sections. Okay, let's just move on with attacking a sediment management plan. What do we already know? 1955 to 2012 is the current window of our surveys that we have as of today. Extensive regional sediment management program studies on the Niobrara, sediment strategies report, extensive numerical modeling that we've done from Fort Randall down to Sioux City, and we're working on, Fort Randall to Gavins, and we're working on another piece of modeling right now below Gavins as part of this phase 2 to assess that if we had a reintroduction of sediments below Gavins Point Dam, what might happen to the river downstream. And then the survey studies reports on all the different creeks. What we don't have and what we intend to put a fair bit of effort in on the front end here is the economics of sediment management. The traditional benefit cost ratio for a project looks at new benefits created through the project. Is that a flood control benefit? Is it a recreation benefit? Is it a hydropower benefit? What is the new benefit it's creating? Which is a little different than what we're trying to do here. Because in a sense, we're trying to protect benefits, right? They're an established set of benefits that were provided by the reservoir and the river, okay? And those are being chronically eroded over time due to the sedimentation, okay? But in a traditional benefit cost ratio, I'm not creating any new benefits. I'm protecting existing benefits. So that model never works in our favor on sediment management. It never gets above 1 unless you waited till the point where it plugged the powerhouse or something like that, and nobody wants to wait that long. So one of the things we've looked at and what we hope to do here is look at while we do need to do the benefit cost economic analysis because that is our standard process. One of the other economic models for civil works infrastructure is called Lifecycle Economics, and it's what is the necessary investment to keep and maintain and continually provide the benefits that the civil works project provided. And in that case, it still has a BC ratio, but what we can do is we consider, we used to have $2 million of flood control, and now we've lost $1 million of flood control. So through that type of model, we can say that we're protecting or we're saving $1 million or $2 million, however many dollars of flood control protection that would be lost if we let the sediment take it away. So what we're going to try and do here in this sediment management plan is do some scoping, identify and do some economic and engineering analysis on a number of methods that we've already been working on, that we've considered, throughout the last decade. And then, ask those economic questions and see if there is a path forward with either the benefit cost ratio model or the lifecycle economic model. And then if we have traction there in phase 2, we'd move that to a full laid out sediment management plan, which would identify specific actionable items that could be done under the auspice of that economic and environmental analysis to protect or regain benefits that the system already provides or did provide in the past. So where we sit right now is we are in this phase 1 project scoping. Mark and Sandy handed out the PMP. If you do have insomnia, this is the trick. This will put you out cold, okay? The last 4 pages of it are standard boilerplate government talk, but the first 3 or 4 pages specifically lay out what we want to accomplish and how we're going to try and accomplish it, okay? It is in draft form right now, and we'll have a slide a little later on what everyone here can do to participate in this process. But in this phase 1, we're going to scope these other 2. We're going to lay out a path forward and say what, currently studied methods, we've got a number of them. Which of those do we want to put our blood, sweat, and tears into on this economic analysis? And then expanded analysis, with innovative or new methodologies. Which of those can we include in phase 3 and the like? So we have just started kind of that process. So this is a scoping effort for goals, tasks, and products. We split it into phases for incremental investment and because we want to address these economic models early in the process. Because the life cycle economic model is not standard process. It is not normally how civil works O&M projects are evaluated and justified. So we're going out a little on a limb here. We're trying something new because we think this is the sort of model that's going to need to be used, not just here, but in a much wider cross-section of these civil works projects, whether it be us or the states or Bureau of Reclamation, NRCS, whoever it is. If we're going to justify sediment management, we're going to have to be able to account for and justify the preservation of the benefits that the system provides. Okay? So what we did in this phase 1, and you don't have to read this all through, it is on the 2nd or 3rd page of your PMP, the project management plan. But this is something I wrote. If you don't agree with it, this is your opportunity to provide feedback on it. This is a section that I wrote, and I got, many of you know John Remus. I got his approval. I said, look at this. I'm going to make you too angry. And he goes, no, that's fair. So there we go. And then an identification of where we stand now. And this is one I just added the other day to make sure we are accounting for the downstream reach, right? In 1179, it specifically calls out the reservoir, okay? And you'd have to decide what that footprint is. But it didn't naturally identify the downstream channel. In moving to section 1122, moving to section 22, which is what we're using, the federal government and the sponsor have the ability to collectively decide on what the area of concern or the project footprint is. And so we put that in there that, we've resulted in channel degradation, reduction in habitat, and other infrastructure impacts. You can decide how far down those go. Sandy and I had a chuckle beforehand. I said, we can make the scope, the footprint of the study as wide as, as far as you want, because technically if you move sediment below Gavin's, eventually it may make it to New Orleans, because it's an unimpeded river below here. But costs are directly proportional to scope, right? So we have to find that sweet spot where we do honestly think we are encompassing all of the inputs, all of the impacts, and all of the benefits without chasing the tail of the downstream or other upstream impacts. So that is part of the scoping process, so that the sponsor and our office agree on that. There is no long-term, there's no long-term plan to mitigate the loss. The long-term plan is that the reservoir and the river will continue to collect sediment. So here's the objectives, and these, as I said earlier, these are modeled very much after the 1179 objectives that were laid out in that legislation. First and foremost, that there are beneficiaries and stakeholders that are equal partners in this discussion. Evaluate the sediment, volume, impacts, economic benefits, impact of previous and future sedimentation, management options, constraints, to the maximum extent practicable, use, develop, and demonstrate innovative cost-saving technologies. And in the end, what you get to is a sediment management plan with recommendations of sediment management actions that can serve the greatest benefits and attempt to establish a sustainable reservoir. That is the end goal. That is the panacea of this thing, but incremental steps lead us to that, with trying to find management actions that first extend our life, and every one of those moves us closer and closer to a sustainable system. And sustainable, generally, in our definition of that as civil works, is in equals out. Okay, what the Niobrara, the Missouri River, the watershed, Ponca Creek, Bazille Creek, through here, what they are delivering to Lewis and Clark and the river reach directly upstream of it, what they are delivering would be removed on an annual basis. And I am a strong proponent of the idea that the volume is so large that our primary focus needs to be on reintroducing some of those sediments to the Missouri River channel downstream of the dam. There just isn't practically anywhere else to put them. If we get an acre foot, if we've got 2,500, 2,600 just in the reservoir acre feet per year, 9 acre feet per day, 8 acre feet per day. So an acre foot is about a football field. So just in the course of this presentation, we'll fill a football field a foot deep with sediment. Okay. By the time we get back to Omaha tonight, there'll be 8 feet of sediment on that football field. I mean, that's the scale of the issue. Phase 1 content. This simply lays out what we hope to accomplish in Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. As part of, and MSAC asks that we kind of add this Phase 1 onto the front end, which is completely understandable. The sponsor wants to know what they're getting into, right? And they want to have a long-term plan on here, because every dollar is important, and there's never enough dollars to go around. So MSAC is, and the sponsor group has made the decision to put a few dollars up front into the scoping process, so that we have a clear roadmap of what we're going to do in Phase 2, and then based on what we find out in Phase 2, a roadmap of what we can accomplish in Phase 3. Neither of these two phases is the sponsor group legally obligated to follow up on. Each one of these phases is independent. It will have its own amendment to a cost share agreement with the federal government, and the sponsor has the opportunity to step away at any time if they are not sufficiently happy with the performance. Okay? So here's where we sit on this phase 2 and 3 scoping. So phase 1, and the long and the short of it is we'd like to accomplish this May, June, and July, so that we are in a position to have a pretty good scope for phase 2 and move out on that early in our new fiscal year, which starts in October. It does include, everybody putting their teams together, coordination concurrence of scope for phase 1 with sponsor. Hey, we're ahead of schedule. That'll never happen again. Let's be clear on that. That was your one shot at being ahead of schedule. But that's what that is right in front of you. That's the phase 1 scope, okay, that we're talking about, getting coordination concurrence with the sponsor. Then we will talk what we want to include in phase 2. Okay, what previous research can we bring to bear? What analysis has already been done? How much we think the river has changed in the last month? I mean, there's all kinds of discussion items to do there. One of the major cost savings in this process is that we've done in our office a fair bit of hydraulic modeling using the post-2011 surveys. We know those are out of date now, so the decision has to be made. How much out of date are they? How much different would the answers be today on that analysis than they were a couple of months ago? And then once we do this scoping and we've got tangible tasks in phases 2 and 3, which are suggestions, then we will be back up here to talk all of that through and make sure that people understand what we are trying to do. And if we've missed anything, or there is a discussion that we don't want to do that analysis, we want to do that analysis instead, there'll be opportunity to rework all of that. And then we'll get down here to doing cost estimates. And there's no obligation at that point, but that may be a point where we say, this is what we want, this is a Cadillac, but I've always wanted a Cadillac, but I drive a Chevrolet. And there's a feedback loop in there to decide what is really important and what the resources are best, directed at. And then wrap up the project management plan update, and then have something that we're ready to roll out on. So the Draft Pmp everybody has. Sandy has it electronically if you didn't get a copy of it today, and you would like to review it. Down through at least the first couple of sections, which identify objectives, tasks, goals, the schedule, and the budget, which Sandy agreed that we could keep in there. The federal cost share agreement that we proposed has been up through our division and is now down back working through other signatures. But it is being routed, it is in process, but it has been approved by the people, not us, the important people. Yeah, the division, Northwest Division out in Portland, they have approved it and they said it's go. So we are planning for that. We will get that to MSAC. We want to resolve the comments in the next couple of weeks. We'll complete phase 1 by the end of July. And the goal is to start this fall. Now, at this point, I didn't ask Sandy about this, but in these early stages here, we would sure appreciate it if we could coalesce the edits, revisions, comments, and all of that, just so when they come into Tim and I, we have a clean and efficient pathway. So 1, we don't miss anybody's comments. And 2, we can respond in a timely manner. So that's where we sit right now. We don't, at this point, officially have a project yet, but we have one in the very near future when things get signed. So at this point, I will open it up for questions. Yes?
Being involved in the consulting side of businesses for a long time, the thing that I'm wondering is that when we do this objective, as you first pointed out, the study of the objectives and identify the following. They're good questions. I always like to see some estimate. And it's like more than one, less than $1 million, or just get it close. And I guess as far as if we had answers to every one of your objectives in the first phase there, it would give us a little better target to shoot for. I'm just wondering if, in fact, is it asking too much to give some estimates of what you're seeing in those objectives that you put on your first phase there? We're paying $25,000 for that, but I'm just wondering if, in fact, there's some way of getting some way of understanding what number we are probably likely going to see before you do the study.
You're talking about the objectives in phase 1 here for this scoping effort?
Back one more. It's essentially you have the problems identified in the study, then study the objectives to identify the following. And it's to provide opportunities. And of course, I guess I'd like to see some suggestions as to what you expect to see. Evaluate the volume, some objective as to what kind of volume you're expecting. And again, there's ways of getting those close, and it would give us a lot more information to even see in the early phases as to whether or not this is essentially a pushing a rope or, man, gosh darn, this is not going to work.
Okay. You know, we could, the intent here, and I understand what you're saying, right? We don't want to go down the road of $1 million study and get to the end and then realize this is not what we wanted.
Give you answers to every one of those when we be further down the road and we have some idea so that we can all sit here and say, yeah, those are nice to know, and then 2 years from now we pay $25,000 and what do we have?
Well, the honest truth is the reason you don't have answers to those is because those require time of me to give you those answers. And I am not salaried. There is no project. This is all pro bono right now. So I'm not getting paid by this project. Nobody at the Corps of Engineers is. Okay?
But some sort of good guess, because you really don't have a chance to guessing it.
Yeah, we could do guesses, but they're going to be guesses. And as long as everybody understands that, certainly. But we have not, at this point, sat down and tried to put a guess on these yet. But I understand that that is something we could, as part of this phase 1 thing, we could look at some numbers there.
I agree, and again, as it stands, this has been talked about for 4 and 5 months I've been watching it, and so far we've had this conversation every time, and all our good intentions are there, but we're not seeming to get anywhere, and I just think that we can give some sort of guesses as to what we're looking at.
Okay. All right, other questions, comments? Yes?
Paul, thank you for the presentation, very informative. Appreciate it. When you start to get to phase number 2 and 3, where you're going to be generating economic analysis and have estimates,
Right.
is there going to be an opportunity for whomever to provide comment on those, or methodologies used and things like that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Part of that framework will set the framework for those different analysis as part of this phase 1 scoping. But each one of the phases has a stakeholder review, comment, check-in, multiple spots along the way, not at 99%, right? That's the, here it is, give me comments. No, we'll get early into it, right? And get a little bit of work done. And then we'll feed it back through the sponsors at multiple feedback. And that means, and we'll build enough flexibility. If we need to change it a little, that's not really what everybody had in mind, then we hope to do it early enough in the process to modify that.
About some historic economic analysis on the Missouri River, it's often been questioned by specific interest groups as an example.
Right.
Would those groups have that opportunity then to review this document and to comment on the analyses that were used?
Well, that is at the discretion of the sponsor. Okay? The sponsor, who's footing their half of the bill, can send it out for the greater populace to review it, or they can keep it to just the representatives of the sponsoring partners or whoever. So that's something that the sponsorship, the sponsor team needs to decide. But yeah, you could do it any way you want. But that's at the discretion of the sponsor.
Typically, a lot of our CAP projects that we do, if you'll learn anything about this process with the Corps, our work is reviewed by everybody, it seems like. But one of the things that we build into it is a public review. And the public reviews and comments is a way to feedback into and then we address those comments as they're applicable. We'll at least address them, whether or not they're incorporated or not. It may be determined that they're not. Understand that that's going to be built into this. If the Corps is participating in that and arrange that, that's a cost that we have to include into that. We do it in all our studies. So the short answer is yes, that can be done, but understand that there's going to be a cost to that. Not that we want your money, but somebody's got to pay for it somewhere.
All right, yeah.
Can I assume, by listening to this presentation, that the District Corps office has concluded that nothing in the events of the last 30 days has changed your analysis?
Changed our analysis in the sense that we need to do this project going forward?
Put the 1179 route on hold, jump to section 22, and go through the state assistance program.
No, I do not think that. Now, this is me speaking, not, our district commander. I don't think there's anything that's happened in the last 30 days, 60 days that should change the direction we're going. Okay, there is not post events here. You hear all of this recovery money and repairs and everything going on to the federal levee system down around Omaha. Okay, there's federal repair money there. There is no emergency management action up here associated with this project. There is no new pot of money since last month that would fund this. There is no additional new money for new surveys or new data collection or anything like that. Doesn't mean I am not trying and working the phones, because I do think we need a new survey and I do think we need to reevaluate our area capacities, but I do not have a different path today than I had a month ago to move this project forward.
Second question. Then, given your answer, can we safely conclude that we can limit the stakeholders group in phase 1, 2, and 3 to this area and not run the risk of having Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa define themselves into the stakeholder group?
That, again, is completely up to the stakeholder group right here. Whoever is involved already and whoever wants to be additionally involved, it would have to be an agreement among all the stakeholders of who the stakeholders are. Okay? So if there is not consensus between stakeholders, then it is not a stakeholder group, I would think. Okay?
I would maybe add that some of the discussion about that is being more of an open process, getting people on board downstream and being open up front, because we know it's not going to be just us that can get things approved and funded in the long run, has kind of been the feeling in general. But like this process is intended is to get feedback from all of you and different ideas or opinions on how that all comes together.
Certainly, if down the road this leads to a implementable action that will affect or move sediment down the Missouri River, you are clearly going to have interested parties in Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. But
given the press conferences of the senators and governors of the states, our first task will be to get the literacy rate above 50%.
I'm sorry, am I standing in front of a choir? while you preach? Yes, it's very apparent, right, that we have downstream senators standing up together with no representation of the upper half of the basin. That is clearly understood. It's happening in all the other work we're doing here. But Sandy brings up a valid point that the fact is, at some time, if there is an action, that action has to have the downstream representation on board, or it simply doesn't happen and it gets tied up in court for 20 years.
And another opinion is if they're not brought into the picture at the beginning, one initial reaction may be just to oppose any idea we come up with. So that's some of the feedback and guidance that we've been receiving.
Other questions? Yes.
So, and this I know is just going to be speculation, but in the analysis going forward of the impact on the flooding down with the levees and the flooding and all that,
Okay.
is there any sense that the reduction in the capacity to date of Lewis and Clark Lake, if that capacity at all increased even incrementally, the damage, in other words, if they could have held more water back in the lake, would Omaha and Bellevue would Fremont have flooded?
I understand, and yeah, you're not the first person to propose that or think out loud about that, certainly. As you might expect, we haven't run any numbers on that yet. Our office down there is focused, number one, on getting contracts out to get levees closed, to get water off of I-29, to do that. Mr. Remus, in his annual operating plan presentations a couple of weeks ago, I think alluded to the fact that there's an extremely small volume of flood control volume in Lewis and Clark Lake. It is designed essentially as a re-regulation dam to buffer the Niobrara. Okay, less than 0.1% of the flood storage in the whole system resides in this reservoir. And with the events in this watershed, we filled up all the rest of the multi-purpose storage and exceeded the flood storage overnight on that first night. So would it have appreciably or measurably changed the stage down there if we had more storage up there? I don't know. I just don't know. And that will be part of the post-mortem, right? As we look at what the flow frequencies are in here. On these, what was it, the 14th? Or the 14th or the 15th? The average for the whole day inflow into Lewis and Clark Lake was 120,000 CFS. And so if we take that and know that there's a peak in there that was much higher than that, we filled up what available storage there was in the reservoir very quickly. And the total amount of material, the total amount that came out in that event was multiple times the total storage of the reservoir. So that will come as a post-mortem, but right now we haven't done the math to say if we had a change in storage here, it would affect the water surface down by Omaha by this much. It's a fair question, I just don't have the answer for it at this time. Yes, Sandy.
This is more of a technical question, but it kind of came up in our discussion at the board meeting this morning. And just in how the annual operating plan is presented, those 2 pages of the engineering summary that has all the numbers on it, you have the sediment inflow, the estimation. How does that affect the pools for each of the multi-purpose, the flood control?
We have all that information. We just, it gets very fine to slice and dice that. Many of you have seen our MRB 29, Missouri River Basin 29. It's the sedimentation conditions at Lewis and Clark Lake. We updated that in 2014. In that report, it does break it down by pool. It says we've lost this percentage of the flood control pool, this percentage of the multipurpose pool, this of the carryover pool, and this percentage of the permanent pool. So it is all sliced up like that. We just don't report it at that high level summary. So it's all there.
So those numbers that we're seeing, are they adjusted each year with the different sediment data, or are you going off?
No, those numbers you see in there encompass the range of surveys we have. So the numbers that we presented in that one slide, those are based on the long-term average from 1955 to 2012 when we have our last survey. Now, that's a long-term average, so it's not unreasonable to just take that annual average and add 7 years to it. But in our engineering shop, we say that 90% of the sediment moves with 10% of the water, which means that sediment transport is generally flood driven. Okay? Much more sediment moves with a flood than does on a lazy Tuesday afternoon in August on a river, right? And disproportionately so. It is not a linear relationship. So we do understand that there is certainly a large influx of sediment to the Missouri River, and then in due time to Lewis and Clark Lake from the events of this spring. But we have not quantified that yet, and that's what I alluded to earlier, is I currently don't have a project to get new surveys. We are hoping to get USGS, as Nathan alluded to, is doing some surveys on the Niobrara. We're going to partner with them, see if we can help them out in some of their funding needs there to get a good set on the Niobrara later this fall. So we do have the 2012s from Niobrara River, the bottom 15 or so miles of it, which are part of our federal survey system, and then we'd be able to compare those to these 2019s. So that's the next natural step in that process. Other questions? Yeah.
Another question on process. With implementation guidance, who actually drafts that, and then who's the ultimate approving authority for implementation guidance?
It's drafted by a group that includes engineers, planners, leadership at headquarters, and reaches down to some of the engineers. I was on the implementation guidance team for that one. That's why, because the law says, the authorization says the upper Missouri River Basin. That means what? So as part of our implementation guidance, my suggestion was, let's make upper above Gavin's Point so we can include all of this system with it. So there was a feedback loop there. Now, the decisions that get made about new starts and how it fits into the federal system, those are done very high up, and all of our implementation guidance is approved by the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, the ASACW. They go through that office and then feedback, and then are released at that time. So that usually is about a 6-month process after we get some sort of new law on the books to get that done. So other things, items, questions? Yes?
In your presentation, you talked about moving that sand down the river.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't think there was any other viable way to do anything, did I take that out of context? You said
no, no, you didn't. I think the concern is simply the volume, because any sediment we take out of the river, wherever it is, the Niobrara, the Missouri, mouth of Ponca Creek, wherever, because of floodplain impacts and the like, unless we remove it from this local watershed, we retain the possibility of it coming back into the system. And then we're not getting anywhere. I'd hate to get in. We have navigation canals, where they dredge every couple of years, they pile it up on the side and it slides back in, and then they dredge it out again and they slide back in. And that's what we don't want, right? We want, when we take a management action on this volume of sediment, I want it to be somewhere where I don't have to manage it again. And in my opinion, the only practical place to do that is for at least a fair bit of it is look at the river channel. Sandy and MSAC have been tirelessly looking for places, we'll give the sand away if anybody wants it. We have a section 1146 in the new WRDA that says, it's an appropriation that allows the federal government to give away sand or, sediment from a federal project if somebody wants it. In other places in the country, there are people that want it. Right now, we're having a hard time finding anybody that wants the sand out of the river. And so if that is a limitation and we have a lot of volume to deal with, primary practical place to look is to the downstream channel. That, of course, brings with it its own problems. That is not a silver bullet. We have a degraded channel below the dam, which provides a little bit of flood protection. There are, floods that used to come out of the bank down there that don't anymore because that channel is degraded 8 to 10 feet. So there may be some opposition to any type of management activity that might raise the bed of that river and increase flood risk. So we need, and that's something we will consider in here, that not all of it is benefits, these economic benefits. There will be economic impacts, and we need to do the math. These are the pluses, these are the minuses. Do we increase flood risk downstream? Do we negatively affect ports? Do we negatively affect water intakes? Do we negatively affect other things downstream with this reintroduction of sediment, so that we can do honest math? It's a little disingenuous to just do the plus math in the reservoir without doing the minus math in other parts of the watershed. So, other questions? Yeah?
There's a study done where it would benefit the downstream, some amount of sand and movement of that would help the different.
Agreed. There are many benefits. Absolutely. Like we said, habitat benefits there. There are ecosystem benefits down there, and that part of the river definitely needs sand. The question is, where do we find the balance between what we can get out of the system here to extend the life of this and not scupper some of those benefits downstream? So, yeah, Larry.
Larry Weiss, 15 years with MSAC. I want to thank you, first of all, for making this presentation. And in my opinion, this is probably the most positive and the closest to moving sediment, which people have been talking to us about ever since we started.
Right.
And certainly your attitude toward this, as opposed to the folks that Howard, Paul, and I talked to 15 years ago, is significantly different and better.
You guys were just born too early.
I know that.
I can't fix that for you. Or I was born too late. Yeah, that's probably closer to the truth. But
appreciate the fact that maybe we can get to a point where something more positive can be done, looking years ahead instead of, well, it keeps coming and that's just the way it is. I, for one, as an engineer, feel it doesn't have to be that way, that there are some things that can improve our situation.
Sure. Appreciate the comments, Larry. And I think one of the things that you may have heard me say through this is we've never done the holistic math on what we're trying to save. What is the value of the hydropower plus the recreation plus the flood control plus the habitat benefits plus the flood risk reduction in the upper part? And until you have that number and you can put that in front of somebody and say, look, it is worth spending dollars to protect this resource because this is everything it's providing.
Can I add something to that? The Corps has all sorts of guidance that they have to follow. And some of the direction that I was given, for instance, the economics, and I'm an economist. What we're going to look at here from my boss, Brad, he he wants to, we have a certain way that we look at the economics, and Paul and I have already had a discussion about things that they've done throughout the world. We're looking for an economic analysis different what the Corps previously does to determine if a project is viable. So we're going to try to look at innovative ways that can address the issue and come up with a reasonable or an economically viable project. Because the way the Corps does that is we have a benefit cost ratio. It has to be greater than 1 to even consider the project. If it's not, forget it. Even if it's above 1, and some of my projects are above 1, it's not enough to get the interest to want to do it because too many things could go wrong and drops it down. So with this project, the direction that I was given is we're going to be sitting down with the economics people and talk about what are some innovative ways we can address this issue of the Corps' guidance on other projects to make this work. Just to give you an idea what their thinking is.
Right, and that's not the standard planning process.
Well, 22 studies a little different, but if this went to 1179, we'll have to try to justify that, and that's what Brad's job is to say, hey, this is what we came up with.
Right.
And I've already written something with, I looked at some of the guidance, it was absolutely wrong. So I wrote a white paper on saying this is how you have to do it correctly. So he's open to that as well.
Right, and that's something I honestly think that's changed in our organization over the last 10 to 15 years, is willing to think a little bit outside the box on this very stodgy process here. Now that doesn't mean I'm not going to meet with resistance as these type of products go, up the chain of command. And I fully expect that somebody's going to call me and say, you can't do it that way, okay? Because that's not how we've done it in the past. But we're not going to write this as instead of, we will do the BC ratio, that is required, the standard cost, and then we want to do life cycle and say, look, what we're not doing here is accounting for the benefits we're saving. The BC ratio model was developed to justify the projects. Why can't we use a different economic model to justify saving the projects? So that's what we're going to do, and this was a recommendation in this phase 2. Go out early on this was something that many of you know. Dr. Roland Hotchkiss at BYU, who has worked intimately with MSAC, and he and I kind of wove this web on an early call late last fall and said, and he brought up, and he was right. He's like, you're going to experience resistance. This is not normally what you do, so it might be good to go out early and take your lumps early. And see whether you can get some traction on it. Let's not spend everybody's money and get all the way down here with this. And if we encounter resistance, have it happen there. Let's ask these questions early so that we have a chance to work through them and address them and modify and see if we can find a champion and people to support this sustainable management model. So that's what we're going to do. Yeah, Howard.
Well, just a comment. There's 8 authorized purposes on these dams. And if you look at them, there are stakeholders in every single one of them that need to be heard. Recreation, water quality. When the dams were first authorized, there were very few drinking water quality extractions from the Missouri River. The only ones that had it were the major cities sitting along it and some of the minor ones. Now look at it. We've got rural water systems in this state that literally blanket the state in total. And that's not only here, it's all the way up and down the river, including on south of the dams. So there are all sorts of stakeholders in this that have to be heard, because if you don't hear them, you're not going to get anywhere. Remember, you've got to convince not only South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, because we don't have much power in Congress, folks. You've got to get the power in Congress to recognize the need for these dams. Everybody focuses on flood control right now because we've had a bad situation. All right, that's a plus with Congress as far as getting them to fund anything, right?
Generally, yeah.
But the routine day-to-day stuff, no. So we have to get the stakeholders involved in this. If we don't, it's not gonna go very far.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a valid point, and that's something we should consider in the one in this phase one scoping. Are we fully integrating the people that need to be heard, and do we need to expand that feedback loop to make sure that we've got everybody? Because as Howard points out, there's a lot of other people that aren't in this room who have very strong opinions on how the river should be managed, and the like. So yeah, we will certainly make sure or do our very best to make this as broad a catch as possible.